Herod the Great was the man that tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby. So insane that he was paranoid during the end of his life. He had 2 of his own sons put in prison because he suspected that they wanted to take over his throne. Now, most fathers would go, I want my son to take over my business. Not Herod the Great. Throws 2 sons in prison. While in prison, Herod the Great, who was going insane because of intestinal worms. Intestinal worms were a big problem when cooks didn't wash their hands. The larvae go from feces to food, from food to your body. There they grow into worms that can reach 11.5 inches. Then they lay eggs. The larvae begin migrating through the body, and they particularly like lung tissue and brain tissue, which is why people being eaten by worms cough up worms and they go crazy. Josephus says that Herod, in his older age, was so paranoid and so insane that he was sure that everyone was out to get him. Yet he was also very obese. Part of it was because he was a glutton. Part of it was because of the swelling of intestinal worms in his abdomen. Josephus records that every orifice of his body produced worms. Go figure. So here's this guy who's fat. He's being eaten alive from the inside out. He smells like rotting flesh because that's what he is. He couldn't even stand his own breath. Herod the Great, who built all this, would sit up, and when he sat up, his weight would pull on his lungs, and so he would wheeze. Now just think of this old, nasty guy. He couldn't stand his own breath. And then because of the worms, he would have convulsions, and then his blubber would just rattle. That was Herod the Great when Jesus was born. And the Bible records that he went after all the infants of Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger, probably less than 20 infants. His greatest tragedy was not in Bethlehem. This is why Josephus says nothing about it. His greatest tragedy was that he built a hippodrome like this in Jerusalem, and he went through all the noble families, and he said to all the noble families, he captured them and told his sister, which was also his lover, different story, when I die, kill all the nobles. Why would you do that? Because he realized that he was so hated, at his funeral, no one would weep. And so he wanted everyone to cry at his funeral. You know what his sister did? This is unbelievable. As a politician, he's unbelievable. Everything he touches turns to ashes in his home. Everything he touches in public turns to gold. Can you think of any politicians like that? So when he dies, his sister releases all the politicians, and the people of Jerusalem were so grateful, they gave him an honorable king's burial. Crazy, crazy. Herod, in the midst of all his insanity, tries to stab himself with a paring knife as he's eating an apple. Of course, he's too fat. He can't get to any vital organs. The soldiers then start crying, Herod's killed himself, Herod's killed himself, Herod's bleeding, the king is dying. His sons in prison begin to rejoice. And because of that, when Herod recovered, he killed them. That's not the only member of his family he killed. I'll tell you later how he assassinated his favorite wife, Mariamne, and then went crazy and is walking through the walls of the palace. Can you see the palace over there, the columns? He's walking through the palace and he orders his guards to call out Mariamne's name, even though she's dead, because he missed her so badly. Now, where those columns are is also a swimming pool. That's luxury, baby. Underneath the swimming pool is a prison. You know who stayed in that prison for 2 years? For 2 years. Not under Herod the Great. Herod the Great dies. His sons take over. It was his son, King Agrippa. He throws Herod in prison, and for 2 years, the Apostle Paul is in that prison underneath those rocks. So just take a moment here and see all the luxury. Behind you are the royal archives. These are all storage units for the food, the gold, the power. This is the Washington, D.C. of Israel in the ancient days, which is why you see mosaics all over. And in fact, if you walk along the hippodrome, when you see a square rock, that's not a rock. That's a tile of one of the thousands and thousands of mosaics that Herod the Great laid here years ago. As I mentioned, the Romans invented cement, but the first person to ever cure cement underwater, making for artificial bays, was our friend Herod the Great. And he did it right out here. And you can still see under the water some of the remains of the cement that he cured to make this the major harbor of the ancient world on this side of the Mediterranean.